Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're watching this. If you're just joining us, welcome to the 6th Annual Policy Summit, Issues and Implications, What Kidney Patients Need to Know. I'm Ed Hickey, President of AAKP and fellow kidney patient. After a robust discussion regarding the Living Donor Protection Act, I'd like to switch gears away from policy and focus this session on supportive services available for living kidney donors. Transplant professionals and industry continue to make major strides in providing more life-saving transplants, including preemptive transplants before the need for dialysis. As we work to increase living organ donation, it is imperative that resources are available to support the generosity and altruism of living donors. One organization that plays a critical and immensely positive role is the National Living Donor Assistance Center. For the past 15 years, NLDAC has had a mission to reduce the financial disincentives to living organ donation by supporting non-medical costs such as travel expenses, lost wages, and dependent care expenses. Joining us today is Marie-Claire Walters, Senior Coordinator at the National Living Donor Assistance Center, David Rodriguez, AAKP Board of Directors, Ambassador, and a kidney and liver transplant recipient, and my second in command, Jennifer Jones, AAKP Vice President, Ambassador, two-time transplant recipient, and retired United States Marine Corps veteran. I'd like to begin our panel by inviting Marie-Claire to talk a bit about NLDAC's operations. Welcome, Marie-Claire.
Thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, NLDAC is a reimbursement program that helps people who would like to donate a kidney or a piece of their liver to overcome some of the financial barriers they may face in that process. We help with things like travel expenses, we can pay them back for lost wages if they miss work, and we can help with childcare costs like finding a babysitter to watch their kids while they recover. Even though it's living donors who we help directly, ultimately the program is funded by the federal government with the goal of making sure that people who need a transplant have access to a living donor transplant. If they have someone who would be willing to donate, making sure that person doesn't face any financial barriers. NLDAC's really focused on helping people who need a transplant and who have a low or a moderate household income. And this is because even though we all know you can't give someone a financial reward for donating to you, the law specifically allows recipients and anyone else to reimburse donors reasonable expenses caused by the donation. So transplant recipients are allowed to reimburse travel costs, allowed to reimburse lost wages and childcare, but the reality is that most people who need a transplant are not in a financial position to do that. So that's where NLDAC comes in. It's our mission to make sure that no financial barriers keep anyone from getting a living donor transplant. So we help those donors so their recipients can get a transplant and they don't have to worry about their travel costs or how they'll pay their bills during their recovery while they'll be off work. So we really encourage everyone who needs a transplant to look into whether their potential donors would be eligible and mention this program when they talk about their search for a living donor. As long as you're both U.S. citizens or lawfully present residents and live here in the U.S., the only other requirement is that the household income of the person receiving the living donor transplant is below a certain limit. The limit depends on how many people are in the household, and there's a chart on our website, so you can easily go and see if people who might donate to you would be eligible for this program. As a general idea, for a family of 4, the recipient can make up to $105,000 a year and their donor would still qualify. And even if your household income is a little bit above what the chart says on our website, we can subtract your medical expenses. So we think these income guidelines cover about half of all U.S. households. So a lot of people are eligible for this assistance and they just need to find out about it and apply. One of the challenges we're working on tackling is making sure that everyone who can benefit from this program finds out about it early in the process and has a chance to apply, particularly among communities that may have had lower rates of getting a living donor transplant transplant. So if there's any financial barrier in the mix about what they might be concerned about, we want to make sure we reach them early as they're in their decision-making process and can address those financial concerns. Often donors find out about this program at their evaluation when they've gotten to the transplant center. But we think if we could get the word out among people who are looking for a living kidney donor or looking for a living liver donor, and they would mention this program as they talk about their search for a donor, it might make a lot more people who hear about their story think getting evaluated is something I could afford to do. We know this makes a big difference in people's decision making because 80% of the donors we help report that they could not have donated without this program's support. So if more people could hear about this assistance as they're considering beginning the evaluation, we think a lot more people might be able to come forward as living donor candidates.
It's a great program, and we hope that by your joining us today, even more individuals will learn about it and take advantage of its services. I'd like to invite my fellow board members, Dave Rodriguez and Jennifer Jones, to join the conversation and share their insights on how the advance of important efforts of NLDAC. In your opinion, how can we expand awareness of the National Living Donor Assistance Center among communities that have lower rates of transplantation, such as African Americans and Hispanics? Jennifer, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Marie Claire, for everything that you do to remove financial disincentives to living organ donation. Well, we're already doing it now, right? Like with events like the summit and the Healthline webinar, which we had about a month ago. It definitely increases awareness and can be shared with others. You know, awareness can also be expanded by educating people through educational workshops, seminars, health fairs, and other community events. Also, it's so important in communities like within the African American and Hispanic population is to collaborate with patient and health advocates that live there, that are amongst fellow individuals who are dealing with these issues. The local leaders within the church and other significant groups that have a large voice that will be accepted and heard. We can also leverage social media platforms by creating informative content, stories of successful transplant experiences from within their communities, and address common myths and misconceptions about transplantation.
David, please add your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Claire and Jennifer. I think what's important too, as a former patient relations specialist for a transplant center here in San Antonio, I had the privilege of visiting over 200 dialysis centers and having lobby days to every single small communities in rural areas here in Texas. But I do know that not only affects in smaller rural areas in my state, but also affects across the country. One of the things is that we would like to, in those communities that we need to ensure that all outreach materials are in Spanish that could relate to patients so that they'd be able to read what are the benefits to communicate the importance of living organ donation, and also to have testimonials of living donors that benefited from NLDAC and to share their success stories and inspire and encourage those potential donors.
Leads me to our next question, which is, what do you think this program can do to increase its impact on populations that have lower transplantation rates? Jennifer, let's go back to you.
All right. Well, I initially learned about NLDAC from my living donor. My first transplant was from an amazing living donor. The transplant center told her about it so she could apply. But I thought initially, like, wow, if I would have known about this while I was in pursuit of a living donor, that would have been an advantage to me. That would have been like another tool in my arsenal to seek out a living donor, because it's a lot to ask people to not only donate for someone that they don't know or don't really have familial or friendly ties with, like a complete stranger, but to ask them to take time off of work to go through a medical procedure that demands recovery time, and to possibly rely on someone else to care for their children and their other responsibilities in the meantime. That is a tall ask. So being able to provide that information as well as all the other valuable information while pursuing a living donor would just be so beneficial. As Marie Claire mentioned, it is extremely important for fellow patients to spread the word about NLDAC, and also to educate fellow patients to assist them in pursuing a living donor.
Thanks, Jennifer. Great insights. And David, what do you think this program can do to increase its impact on populations that have lower transplantation rates?
You know, knowing this piece of information, Ed, I think it's very vital. A lot of people don't know in small communities. And I think it's very important to really speak to the dialysis patient, especially those mature adults that daughters are willing to donate. Also to have a sense of comfort for them to know that they're going to be okay, because a lot of them they're afraid for them to lose their wages or their monies, for them to have the opportunity once they do the evaluation, knowing the dialysis, to convince dialysis patients to let their loved ones do that. But also my experience is I have dialysis that, you know, they want to donate, and so as a former representative of the transplant center, I would, you know, always refer them so they could get more information and criteria, and this is where they would get that information from NLDAC. But I think with communicating with the social workers, the dialysis units, to provide that information, because also potential donors, they also go through the social worker on behalf of the recipient, and so they get to talk to them to see that they want to be a potential donor. And this is a really great opportunity for them to say, look, you know, NLDAC is an opportunity for you to apply, especially for those people, recipients that live on a disability. As a recipient myself, when I was on dialysis, I had no source of income. So the only source of income I had was a disability that would probably like about $1,100 that didn't cover my costs. So that's something now I think it would have been beneficial for me to continue with everything, especially when it started the evaluation process.
Thank you, David. That's very compelling. And I have a final set of questions, taking into account that you're both transplant recipients. And Jennifer, you personally have experienced receiving a kidney transplant from a living donor and a deceased donor. We're interested in touching on the non-medical barriers people face when preparing for a transplant. And for you, Jennifer, did you or your donor encounter any financial barriers which were non-medical related that were imperative to address?
Well, fortunately, my donor was all right. Her support system was amazing, and she did not have issues with her job, so she had a very ideal experience. I would attempt to offer her money for travel and food, and she would always decline, like, no. But the most challenging barrier for me was transportation. I lived over 2 hours away from my transplant center, and the traffic could increase at times. You know, going to Walter Reed at Baltimore, Maryland, that traffic is something else. So having to go to multiple appointments multiple times a week was draining physically and draining on my bank account. For this recent transplant, I faced some medical challenges that also put me in that same hospital quite a few times, which prolonged the process to be cleared for transplant. So that's more days driving back and forth to, 6 hours round trip at a time at the least. So if my appointment wasn't early in the morning, that pretty much took up the majority of the day. So I would get home late in the afternoon, and that means working as out of the question. As a contractor, if you don't show up, then you don't receive income that day. So with all of that, I'm extremely grateful that I received VA compensation, which aided me during this challenging time. But yes, that transportation was the biggest challenge for me.
I see. And David, final response from you. What were some of the non-medical things that you had to work through? You touched on them a little bit, but thinking about family, work, time off, and those sorts of things, what were you dealing with?
For me, it was a huge burden as an independent person. I'm from my hometown in Brownsville, Texas. I had to commute to San Antonio, which is about 4 hours away. And during the evaluations, to make arrangements in order so I could be able to dialyze at the center in San Antonio. Meanwhile, I was going through the evaluation. The amount of gas, the places to where you can stay was very minimal. Sometimes I would do it in the same day, exhausted because I couldn't afford a hotel. And so it was really, really difficult for me that I actually moved to San Antonio. I had the crazy idea to live in a small apartment so I could be able to, comply to all the the criteria that they required in order for me to be on the list. As far as my donor also lived about 4 hours away. He's from McAllen, Texas. I was part of the pair exchange donation, so he had to already make two drastic changes for him. He was the propane technician, so really he really didn't have that much benefits for him to travel and everything. But I do believe that he also benefited from NLDAC. After post-transplant, we had our transplant in 2011. So it did work out for him. The only thing I could offer for him is that the same promise I gave to my father and the same promise I gave to him, to God, that I was going to continue to advocate for all those patients. And I'm very fortunate to be here today and to express that I started from my small community to where I am today to promote living donation.
Wow. Thank you both. And thank you, Marie Claire, for sharing the great work in the National Living Donor Assistance Program with us. I'd like to close our panel discussion with a reminder to visit the session box for this panel to review the supplemental resources offered. You'll find a link that takes you to the National Living Donor Assistance Center where you can learn even more. And you'll also have access to a recent webinar that's available on demand that AAKP did in partnership with NLDAC. And finally, you can access a link that will take you to a brief survey where you can share your own thoughts and opinion on supportive services for living organ donors.